You're listening to Beyond the Campaign, and this is episode number 2. Welcome to Beyond the Campaign. I'm your host, Michelle Glogovac, podcast publicist, author, and host of this show and Read the Damn Book. Here, you're going to learn from political candidates and from politicians. We're not just going to talk about the issues. We're going to talk about the human beings who are investing themselves in us so that we can invest ourselves in them. This is Beyond the Campaign. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Michelle Glogovac, and today I am talking to Justice Anita Earls. She is a former civil rights attorney and is currently the Supreme Court Justice in North Carolina and running for re-election. I am so glad I got to talk and meet with Justice Earls to discuss what her journey has been like to getting to where she is, to being a single mom, going to Yale, now being a grandma and up for re-election. I asked her also what she's most passionate about and what her most memorable case has been. Stay tuned as she even shares how she got to the Supreme Court. Hi, Justice Earls.
Hello.
I am so excited to get to meet you and to learn more about you and your journey and everything that you are all about. So, can you take a moment to introduce yourself to everyone, please?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and for this opportunity. So, my name is Anita Earls. I currently serve as the Senior Associate Justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Prior to that, for 30 years, I was a civil rights attorney, which basically means I defended the rights of people in a wide variety of circumstances. And I am on the ballot in 2026, so I am now also a candidate for reelection.
I love that. A bit about me. My bachelor's and my master's are in law because I thought that I was going to be an attorney someday. Instead, somehow after corporate aviation, I am here doing podcasts.
Whoa.
But I love your journey goes back to really childhood, I feel like, because you were adopted by parents who are in a biracial marriage. And
Some
I feel like reading that background helped enlighten me as to why you were a civil rights attorney. Can you take us back to uh, your parents' journey really and what brought them to having you and whatnot? Because I think it tells an incredible story that happened yet not that long ago.
Wow, thank you. So, yes, my parents met in Missouri in the late 1950s, and my father was black, my mother was white. And at that time, it was illegal for them to be married in Missouri. So, luckily, in many ways for me, they moved out to Washington State. At the same time, my biological parents, my mother was black, my father was white. Interesting little wrinkle. And according to the uh, rules at the time, mixed race children like no one could adopt me. They only would place me with a mixed race family. So I wasn't adopted till I was almost a year old. And as I learned about that, my parents were always very open about my background. And my mother, my mother who raised me could not have children, which is why they needed to adopt. But I always felt so incredibly fortunate because I came so close to not having a family at all. But I think what really motivated me to want to be a civil rights attorney was seeing all of the barriers that my family faced, even in a place like Seattle, Washington. So barriers to the jobs that my particularly my father could have, where we could live, what educational opportunities my family members had. So I just thought that by being a lawyer, I could try to open up opportunities for everyone. That was my motivating force. And I was the first one in my family to be able to graduate from a 4-year institution. And I didn't have, it wasn't like I had lawyers in my family or I found my way to be able to have these incredible opportunities that other folks that I grew up around didn't have. And I've always been incredibly grateful for that, but also constantly understanding the importance of opening up doors for everyone and including thinking about so it's not just that I'm a person of color, it's also that I'm a woman. And interestingly, when I entered Yale Law School in the late 1980s, by that time I was a mom because I took 3 years off between college and law school. And my law school class was only one third women. So we were still women were still making their way into the legal profession, and that's also been something I've tried to do is to forge paths for women lawyers as well.
I love that. I always think of RBG. She's one of my heroes to have, plowed her way through as well. And speaking of the Supreme Court, can we say you were basically shortlisted? You could have Katinji, Brown Jackson, and you you were up there too. I read your Wikipedia page.
That is true, but President Biden made an excellent choice, and Justice Jackson has been such an incredible voice on that court. In difficult circumstances, it's really hard. I know from personal experience, it is really hard to be in the minority and to be writing dissents and in such consequential cases where the US Supreme Court is making so many fundamental and important decisions. I have a little bit of a window into just how incredibly difficult that is and what a tremendous voice she's been on that court.
I couldn't agree more. And there has to be a part of you that might say, "Oh, glad I don't have to be in that position too," because it is so hard. And it makes, I think, the rest of us in America question, if the court is citing this way and overlooking so much, where does that leave us? And as a judge, do you have any insight or can you help us understand what happens when the courts continue to side with the president and overlooking what really should be happening?
Certainly, I think it highlights the importance of this concept of checks and balances, that you need three independent branches of government. But the other thing that I think is so clear from what we're seeing now is that state courts really matter a lot. And so we can point to state courts that are taking actions, for example, to protect women's reproductive rights. And we see state courts that are saying, no, extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional. So trying to put in place guardrails to protect our political process. So I guess the good news is the US Supreme Court is not the only court in America that makes decisions that impact these things. And because state courts can often turn over faster, right? That it's a place in some ways that's closer to the people.
Personal experience, you've been an attorney, now you're a judge. What's the difference? What do you prefer? What makes you decide, what, I want to be a judge and not be on the attorney side at this point in my career?
Yeah, interesting question because I think it's a little unusual to. I was a first time candidate running statewide in the state of over 7 million registered voters after litigating for 30 years. What motivated me was the election of 2016. And with President Trump taking office after that election, it seemed to me that federal courts, and this was before Dobbs and before Rucho versus Common Cause, which is the case about gerrymandering, is before there was explicit indication that the federal courts were not going to protect these rights. But I just had this sense, this gut feeling, if you will, that federal courts were not going to be hospitable to the clients and the communities that I had represented throughout my career. And so having someone on the state court with this kind of civil rights background seemed important. There are very different roles, and I tell law students all the time that the hardest thing for me about being on the bench is that I don't get to bring the cases or write the briefs. I am at the mercy of litigants, and it is truly the genius, creativity, passion of the advocates that makes the difference. It's the lawyers who decide which cases to bring, what evidence to introduce to support their claims, what arguments to make. So I continue to believe that it is the trial lawyers, it is the advocates who are advancing the law, and what I can bring to the role as a judge is having had that experience. But it's really important that we have people who will continue to understand the need to represent people who otherwise wouldn't have representation or otherwise wouldn't have a voice. That was what motivated me as a lawyer, that sense that it's important to in our society, in our political process, in ensuring justice, that everyone have quality, strong representation.
Yes, and that children don't have to represent themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
What has it been like to step into the political candidate sphere? Now for a second time for reelection, but I have to imagine it's completely different going from attorney, as you mentioned, to being a judge. But then there's this whole political aspect that is so different because I know some judges are appointed and you don't run for election. So for you to have to be out there in the face of the public to ask for voters to vote for you, to fundraise, to do all of these things, that's a whole different aspect to all of this. What has that been like for you? Is it a part of the position that you're going, can't wait for that election again? or do you just see that as part of the job now?
Interestingly, I actually like it a lot more than I might have thought I would. And so my message for people is don't just assume that, because you don't think you fit the politician model, that somehow you can't actually be effective running for office. And I think the same thing of the distinction between running versus governing happens in all political offices. But for me, the hardest part actually was talking about myself. As a lawyer, I was happy to get up and tell my clients stories. And actually, as a trial attorney, the thing I liked best was direct examination. So the Perry Mason moment is all about cross-examination and that bit when you get someone on the stand to appear to be lying. But I much preferred the part of the trial where your job is to make you're doing a direct examination. Your job is to make the witness look good. You want them to tell their story. That's what I like the best about trials, and I think it's an underappreciated art. But bottom line, the hardest part was talking about myself and my family. But I felt that you have to as a candidate because people want to know you. They want to know who you are. The rest of it is really not all that different, right? I went as a civil rights attorney, I went around the state talking to people about here's what your rights are, here's how the court system can protect them, here's other strategies. Sometimes things outside of litigation were the best strategy for a community. And being now as a candidate, I'm essentially doing the same thing. I love the opportunity to hear from people, to hear what concerns they have. So, that aspect of it, I'm not a naturally outgoing person, but I've really concluded that people just wanna know who you are and what you're about. So there's no one personality type that makes you a good politician. I think it's being genuine and doing it for the right reasons, I guess, that seem to me to be the most important.
I completely agree. And I feel like we aren't getting to know any politician on that level enough, which is why I'm so glad you're here so that we can all get to know you more. Throughout your career, has there been one case that has stood out to you the most that whether it's like, this was my favorite one, whether you're the judge or the attorney on the case, or the one that's made the biggest difference in your life, just from the aspect of being able to say, yeah, I worked on this case and I did something for it about it?
Yeah, there's a number of cases I could talk about which that had impacts in different ways. But as you were speaking, I thought about the case Shaw versus Reno, which became Shaw versus Hunt. But this was a case involving racial gerrymandering. So the argument that districts were drawn with a racial intent. And my job was representing uh, Black and white voters who were arguing that congressional districts in North Carolina that for the first time since the late 1890s were enabling Black voters to elect their candidates of choice to Congress. So the first two African Americans elected to Congress in the 20th century were from these districts, and we were defending these districts. And the reason the case stands out I was a lawyer at the trial level, so I put witnesses on the stand, introduced evidence, and this case came about approximately 5 years, 6 years into my career, so I was a pretty new attorney. By the time it made it to the US Supreme Court, so I got to write the first draft. A lot of people had input, but I wrote the first draft of the US Supreme Court brief, and I wanted to argue it. By the time I got to the court, I'd been out about 8 years because these cases take time. And I really wanted to the argument was divided. It was a 10-minute argument in the US Supreme Court, and it was like my dream to argue a case in the US Supreme Court. In the end, Julius Chambers, a noted civil rights attorney, argued the case. And there was a moment in the argument when Justice Scalia was pounding him about why these districts matter. And Julius Chambers, for those who don't know him, he was a fairly short in stature and somewhat quiet. Um, his voice level was somewhat quiet, but he kind of stood up to his full stature and said, "It means the same thing to me as it would mean to you if you didn't have the opportunity to elect your choice." And what he fundamentally was saying to that justice was, "We are equal. We are humans. Our humanity is the same, and I should have equal standing in our democracy as you." And to me, that's always been fundamentally what I wanted to be about. And I understood in that moment that it needed to be that advocate who made that argument. So that's, I guess, one case that really has stood out to me. As it turns out, I have never argued in the US Supreme Court. I have sat at counsel table, but the other exciting thing for me was another case that I worked on much later in my career after I'd had 25 years of experience. Um, I could have tried to be the one arguing that case, but another attorney who also worked on the case, who was about 8 or 9 years out of law school, I really encouraged and supported her, and she argued the case. So I felt like I could, in the next stage, give someone an opportunity that I didn't have.
I love that. And you brought up gerrymandering, which is something that has been a big deal in North Carolina, but now we're seeing it in Texas and there's talk about it in California. What are your thoughts on that, and where do we go from there, if you can speak on that in general, since you've argued cases about it?
Yes. Well, so also, I was part of the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2022 that issued an opinion saying under our state constitution, it's unconstitutional to have extremely partisan gerrymandered districts. And there's a really important difference between racial and partisan gerrymandering. But on the partisan gerrymandering side, we laid out measures that a legislature can use to determine whether their maps are fair to both political parties. And this is not at all unusual in the law. So we now have a principle that everyone thinks is absolutely correct, one person, one vote, right? The one person, one vote principle means that districts have to be roughly the same size. Because if you had one district that's 100 people and another district that's 1,000 people, in the 100-person district, you only need 51 votes to win. Obviously, in the 1,000-person district, you need 501. So the people in the small district, their votes have a lot more power, is the point.
Mhm.
That principle actually didn't come about until 1962 in a US Supreme Court case, Reynolds versus Sims and Baker versus Carr, the two cases that established that principle. So prior to that, we didn't have one person, one vote. No, glad that we have it now. Everyone thinks it's absolutely right. I think partisan gerrymandering is the same way. We have measures. We know how to make districts fair to everyone, and it's just gonna. I just feel like it's gonna take a little time, but I think our legal doctrines will get there ultimately. The interesting thing about the California example is that they have citizens redistricting commissions there
Yeah.
instead of the legislature redistricting. So, different system.
I'm in California, so
Yeah.
I'm watching it closely. I know that Newsom's going, well, maybe we can bypass that for this. And
Oh, interesting.
there's going to be all kinds of checks and balances that I know we have to go through to get to that point. But I think it's also interesting when we talk about partisanship in a lot of the areas that we live in. I know that for California, this is definite. There are blue areas, there are red areas. And so it almost doesn't matter how you're going to try to do this because this area is more blue. And, we go a little south and inland, then that is the agricultural more red.
Mhm.
So it feels kind of funny to me to try to redistrict it because you are going to make some weird, crazy shape in order to make it work for you
Right.
because we're all living where we're living.
Right. Well, and there are definitely alternatives to single member districts that would not necessarily rely on geography. And so I'm thinking here of things like limited voting, cumulative voting, single transferable vote, or sometimes called ranked choice voting. I know those are not things that people are generally familiar with, but if we used those methods and there's a lot of different ways to implement them, but if we use those what are sometimes called semi-proportional uh, election methods, then we wouldn't be tied to geography and people with similar interests could combine their voting strength. And for me, as a voting rights attorney, it's always been about the importance of our democracy allowing everyone, making it possible for everyone's voice to be heard. And I think that's how we govern best.
Let's get personal a bit. And how did you were a mom before you went to law school. You went to
Yeah.
Yale, like you strove for the best. And you managed to get through law school, become an attorney. Now you're a judge, you're a grandma. How are you balancing all of this? I don't believe in balance as a word, but how do you manage to do all of this? We've talked about being a female and, how different and difficult that has been, especially throughout your career and having so few female attorneys at the time. What has that journey been like? How are you doing all of this? Why do you continue to do it, Justice Earls?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I've had different um, supports in different ways at different times. So there's like not one single answer for my entire career. And for a time, I was a single mom when my oldest son was in high school. So and I had huge law school loans. I came out of law school, and I managed to get a mortgage before my loans started being due because they didn't show up on my credit record. My loan repayment, my I owed more in law school loans than I did on my mortgage. I mean, I could buy a house for less than I bought an education, basically, is the bottom line. But it's possible. And I did all that on a public interest law salary. So I was not at a big firm. I wasn't earning huge amounts of money. But to me, what was important was doing work that was meaningful to me and all the things, all the comforts that larger salaries can bring weren't as important to me. So I think the message I would have for people considering how do you make all this work is is to continue to believe that if you pursue your passion, you'll find a path. So by different supports, I mean none of us does any of this by ourselves. I've had the fortune to have, a great community around me, good friends. Now, as I'm doing my political work, I have an incredible campaign team. It just, and in my chambers, my court work, which is also a full time job, I have amazing clerks who are just brilliant. I learn so much from them. So understanding that what you're trying to do with your life's work, you're not going to do it by yourself, no matter what it is, and to have a vision of building a community that you're working with, I think is the way you can get through it and enjoy it and feel like you're doing what it most matters to you.
I love that. I love that you're not only doing what matters to you, but you're making such an incredible difference in so many lives with the work that you do and what you are fighting for. So thank you. Thank you for being that human being that we need.
Well, that's encouraging. I will say I am mostly writing dissents, and my heart breaks for the ways in which what our court is, what I see the impact of the decisions of our court being, uh, uh, especially there's a couple of really important issues, but especially education. And when I see young folks not having the basics that they need to get a good education to pursue their skills and talent, they're just not getting the resources they need, it breaks my heart. And so I know that we're in a really difficult time right now across the country for a variety of ways. And what's most important to me is that people understand we have to stand up and speak out right now. This is not a time to like put your head in the sand and hope that the pendulum will swing. Like we've all got to speak out.
I love that. And I hope that it encourages more to speak out because those of us who are doing it, as you know, it's exhausting. So help us out, everybody. Where can everybody find you, donate to your campaign, and cheer you on for this reelection?
Oh, wonderful. So my website is earlsforjustice.com. That's number four, or spelled out the word for, either one, but all one word, Earls, EARLS, earlsforjustice.com. You can sign up there. I'm on 7 different social media platforms.
Good for
Uh,
you.
so just check me out on Blue Sky or Instagram or TikTok, LinkedIn, like you name it, I'm probably there. Um, and I really when I ran in 2018 the first time, I had a very grassroots campaign. 90% of my contributions were $100 or less, and I hope to do the same thing this time. It helps so much, and it really makes a difference. So thank you.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for doing the work that you're doing. We need more of you.
Oh, thank you. It's so lovely to meet you.
Even if you think that the courtroom doesn't have politics involved, think about who the judge is. Yes, some of them do have to be elected. We are voting on them. And I think it was a great journey to listen to how Justice Earls went from being an attorney to being a justice and what that looks like, how we're all involved, and how politics is everywhere. I hope you go and check Justice Earls out more. She is on all the social media channels and she's doing an amazing job. And don't forget to contribute to her campaign. Every dollar counts for all of these candidates. And it's people like you and me who are making these huge differences. Can't wait to join you again on Beyond the Campaign.